I'm delighted to welcome Martin Bardenhewer. Martin is the head of Institutional Clients and Multinationals at ZKB. Many of you already know him, which is great. But for us, the more relevant role that he has is as co-chair of the National Working Group on Swiss Franc Reference Rates. And by way of introduction, the National Working Group is the key forum to foster the transition to SARON and to discuss the latest international developments. And it's co-chaired by a representative of the private sector, and that's you, Martin, and also a representative from the Swiss National Bank, and that's Marcel Zimmermann. And it publishes recommendations in this transition based on consensus. So essentially, it's managing and defining the transition to SARON. This is very complex. The transition to risk-free rates globally and the move away from LIBOR is a very, very complex multi-year process. And we're very lucky to have you, Martin, to come and speak to us a little bit about where we stand in Switzerland with SARON. So if that's okay, I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Marty, for this very kind introduction, actually. Typically, I just talk about only what we have discussed on the last meeting of the National Working Group, which has taken place roughly 6 weeks ago. But for the very first time, I focus now not on the last meeting of the National Working Group, but what has happened in the market and the regulatory space over the last couple of weeks. Great. So I would like to start with a very clear sentence on the next slide, which is just very, very simply, Byebye LIBOR. Ludo, could you just flip the slide? Thank you very much. Because here it's written rather formally that Swiss franc LIBOR is not expected to exist after 2021. So basically, I'd bet a very large sum that LIBOR indeed will cease to exist immediately after end of 2021. And what we've learned in the last couple of weeks, that an announcement of that cessation might come as early as 1 year before, which means as early as late 2020 already. So when you look on the next slide, I will provide you some very basic information before we delve into the latest developments. Here on the upper left side of the graphs, you see in red the volume of the unsecured Swiss franc interbank market or money market over the past 15 years. And essentially after the financial crisis, the market completely dried up. Whereas at the bottom on the left side, the secured market, which is essentially the Swiss franc repo market hosted by SIX, started to grow. It was close to zero in the times of a flat interest rate curve of 0%, because then you do not need any term market. But as soon as we entered negative territory in 2015, volumes grew up again, and we are roughly now at 4 to 5 billion a day, a turnover a day, which is essentially the full Swiss franc money market, because we have only a very limited amounts in OTC space. On the right-hand side, you see some very interesting submission data very recently by end of June. What the sources of these daily submissions are. Blue bar means it comes directly from transactions. Green, it's derived from transactions. And this yellow, red, orange is just a simple expert guess. Well, in US dollar and in pound sterling, you see some limited amount in the overnight unsecured money market or overnight LIBOR. But even in the term LIBORs, you do not see any activities in these currencies. For Switzerland, for Swiss francs, the case is very easy. In Swiss franc, we do not see any activity underpinning each day's LIBOR submission. And this holds not only true for this specific week by end of June this year, this holds true almost since 2 years. So there is no unsecured money market in Swiss franc. And to be honest, there's almost no unsecured money market beyond overnight in US dollar and pound sterling. The day before yesterday, the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, and the president of the New York Fed, John Williams, joined a webinar and they clearly stated that they expressed again their will to end the corresponding pound sterling LIBORs and US dollar LIBORs as well by end of 2021. So there's a strong push against the cessation of all LIBOR currencies, but, and that's important, not for Euribor, because the Eurogroup did not follow suit what pound sterling, Swiss franc, and US dollar group did. So Euribor might or will exist for a foreseeable future. So here indeed we talk about the LIBOR currencies, mainly Swiss franc, US dollar, and pound sterling, which are expected to cease to exist after 2021. On the next slide, we have shown, or we show some the time series of LIBOR here, the 3 months LIBOR, and the corresponding 3 months compounded SARON, because as you know, SARON is a Swiss average rate overnight. So we have to build an average to a compounded SARON for 3 months to compare it to LIBOR. When we look at the right-hand side of this graph for, say, the last 10 years, the difference between these two rates is virtually zero, or very close to zero. And that's very interesting because LIBOR as a term rate and as a credit bearing rate should be significantly above SARON. So we see only some spreads in times of some unexpected rate events. For example, in 2015, when negative interest rates were introduced, and in 2019, end of 2019, when the threshold regime of SMB changed, or in 2020, when we saw volatility in the market due to the corona crisis. In each case, typically the SARON reacts much more quicker, reacts quicker than LIBOR as an overnight rate, but overall, and it's very important, LIBOR has a much higher volatility than the SARON 3 months compounded. On the next slide, I give you some flavor on a decision we made in 2018. Actually, we can focus on what we've done in the past couple of years in 3 decisions. One decision we made in 2018, the first one, was to specify exact. Let me go back. The first decision was in 2017 to go for SARON as the successor of LIBOR, because we analyzed unsecured market rates in depth in 2015, 2016, but we concluded that SARON is the best rate to follow LIBOR. In 2018, we made a decision really to change significantly the regime how a term rate is calculated. As you all know, LIBOR is a forward-looking rate. So the first step would be just simply to go to, say, a 3 months SARON rate or a 3 months SARON future rate, which is again a forward-looking rate. But we have essentially no markets or deep markets in these 3 months SARON swaps, or hardly any market in 3 months SARON futures. So we would be exposed again to significant expert judgments in the determination of the day-to-day SARON or 3 months rate. So we focused on the compounded SARON, and the basic difference between the compounded SARON and the forward-looking LIBOR is that in most cases, compounded SARON is what we call backward-looking. The term rate for 3 months is not known until the end of the interest rate period. This was very hard for some market participants when they thought about this the first time. But we will see on one of the next slides that this was indeed very easy for other market participants to accept. On the next slide, we can show the third decision we made in 2019. And this was exactly how to calculate this term rate, how to calculate a 3 months rate, how to calculate a 6 months rate. When we look into the swap market, into the SARON swap market, the variable leg of the swap is simply calculated by building a compounded average during the interest rate period. And at the end of the interest rate period, the rate is fixed, but the interest rate payment in the SARON swap, as in almost any other derivative, is 2 days later. So this base standard in the derivative market can't be used in the cash market, because in the cash market, we do not have only interest rate payments, but we have also principal payments. And it would be rather weird to have a principal payment 2 days later without paying any interest on that. So we have to look at different alternatives. The simplest alternative is what we call plain, because in Switzerland, if interest rate periods end, say, tomorrow, SARON is fixed this afternoon at 6 p.m. already. So we can calculate overnight the full amount to pay on a loan which matures tomorrow. This is not possible in US dollar or in pound sterling, because in US dollar and pound sterling, as in Ionia and euro, the overnight rate is not fixed in the evening, but in the morning of the next day. So in Switzerland, we could use a plain approach, but the standard in Switzerland and in all other currencies is what we call a look back, which is actually a slight shift of what we call the observation period to the interest rate period by 2, 3, 4, or 5 days. In the retail space, some banks or some product providers argued that clients would not like, retail clients especially, to know their interest rate payments very lately before the interest rate payment date. And so they ask for what we call an in advance approach or last reset approach, which means the payment which will be made, for example, in 3 months from now, will be fixed today, based on the observations of SARON in the past 3 months. In technical terms, this entails some non-hedgeable convexity, and our analysis showed that we see a value of 3 to 5 basis points of this kind of convexity. Well, all the decisions we made were made rather early compared to other currency groups, so we were somehow in some sort of risk that UK or pound sterling and US dollar might go for different options, for different ways to replace LIBOR. But fortunately, they followed our route, and especially this kind of 7 different options was used by FSB as a standard for the full transition of LIBOR to the risk-free overnight rates. So this was the introduction of the basic background. Now let's really look at the important stuff. Let's look what happens currently in the market, what happens in the cash market, what happens in the derivative markets, and what happens in the regulatory space, because there's a lot going on for the moment. On the next slide, you see what happens in the loan markets. On the left side, you see retail loans, which in Swiss francs are almost always mortgages. On the right-hand side, you get some information on corporate loans. So in Swiss franc, we have seen most Swiss banks, or major Swiss banks, not most, but major Swiss banks coming out with products which are slightly different, but which do not fragment the market. So we see 2 different kinds of maturity designs, and we see 2 different kinds of compounding design. We offer perpetual rollover mortgages, while all the other banks offer term mortgages with fixed maturities. Some banks offer the plain option in the compounding to calculate the compounding. All other banks, except for one, go for the look-back options, some for 2 days, other for 5 days. Only one very small bank, Byebye, has announced to focus on last reset only. Credit Suisse has announced to provide or to go with 2 products in the market, with the plain and the last reset options. So most banks go for what we call backward compounding, which was very hard to understand for most salespeople in the banks, which was very hard to accept for product managers. But client feedback and client surveys before the introduction turned out that retail clients have no problems by accepting any kind of backward compounding SARON to replace LIBOR. So customer feedback on these retail products were reported by all banks that came out with these products to be very, very positive. On the corporate loan side, we are not as developed as on the mortgage side. So we see some banks offering corporate loans to SMEs, but we see almost no activity so far for large corporates, for multinational corporates, and for institutional clients. So we've seen only 1 or 2 large transactions as far as I remember. And to be honest, development in the large corporate sector in the loan market is still behind expectations. But here we expect a turning point by end of this year or during the first quarter of next year. On the next slide, you get some insight into the capital markets, into the floating rate note. So the National Working Group fully specified a Swiss franc floating rate note and asked SIX to implement that floating rate note. And we hope that SIX will be able to implement this SARON floating rate note by end of 2021. Of course, there's not currently little incentive due to negative interest rates to issue a SARON or a SARON floating rate note, but nevertheless, we think it's important to have all products available. And in contrast to loans, we need a clear standard for floating rate notes to be implementable by SIX and not to fragment the capital market for variable rate instruments. And in that floating rate note specification, it's called a discussion paper, but essentially it's a full documentation. We formulated for the first time of what we call a SARON fallback language. So what happens if at some distant future point in time, SARON will be replaced by another rate? This legal language is incorporated in that discussion paper. So it's indeed a full documentation for a SARON floating rate note. And again, SARON floating rate note is based upon the standard in the cash markets, which is look back 3, 4, or 5 days. On the next slide, I give you some flavor on how the swap market have developed until May. And here you see the volume of LIBOR swaps, of new LIBOR swaps in gray, and the volume of SARON swaps in blue. And SARON swaps still lag behind LIBOR swaps. SARON swaps have replaced other swaps completely in the space up to say 2, probably 3 years. But for 5 years and even longer terms, 10 years, LIBOR swaps are still much more liquid in the primary market than SARON swaps. This, to be honest, is very disappointing. That's not what we have expected, because we were by far the first currency to introduce SARON swaps and to clear them through LCH and Eurex. We started clearing 2 years before, whereas in Euro, Pound Sterling, and US dollar, clearing has just started a couple of weeks before. However, we are still missing one very important piece for the new products, which are the new ISTA documentation, especially with the new ISTA definitions, which we have to amend to incorporate SARON into the swap space. We expect this definition or this ISTA documentation to be published by August and to take effect in November 2020. It has been delayed because it was planned to be published by early this year, but it had to be delayed due to the incorporation of what we call a pre-cessation trigger, which will play an important role on one of the next slides. Once this ISTA documentation will be published and ensued, not only ISTA documentation will be published, but also the Swiss master agreement will be updated, which is used in the corporate sector very, very strongly. Then we expect a significant push both by the market and by the regulators to go away from LIBOR to SARON products in new businesses. At the same time, we see a growing market for SARON cash products. And once we see a growing market for SARON cash products, we will expect that banks are shifting their FTP curves from LIBOR swaps to SARON swaps, So at the end of the day, we expect a tipping point in the swap market where the blue bars will be significantly above the gray bars in Q4 this year or by latest in Q1 2021. In Swiss franc, we'll still strive to finalize most aspects of the transition before, significantly before, end of 2021. On the next slide, I focus on a different topic because we have learned that the market really get confused about average rates, index rates, compounded rates, and how you name it. So please let me just very briefly highlight here what the difference between an index, a compound rate, and an average is. SARON index, which was called until recently the SION, Swiss Average Index Overnight, now it's called SARON index, is like a bond index. It is pegged to 100 by mid of 1999, and currently it's compounded day by day, and currently it's around 109. This is available as early as 2009 when SARON was introduced. Such an index, which is mainly used in calculating interest for specific periods, has been introduced by the UK group or the pound sterling group as well, and by the dollar group very recently. So indices are more like bond indices. But what you could use or what you could be interested in the day-to-day usage of SARON, SOFR, or SONIA would be something like a 3-month rate. So what exactly is a 3-month compounded rate, which you could read from a screen or from a newspaper? So we have designed such a SARON, what we call SARON compound rate last year, and it's published now by 6 daily since March this year. The US dollar group, has constructed something very, very similar. They do not focus on 3 months, for example, but on 90 days. But otherwise, it's very similar, but they call it average. The reason is because a standard in the retail market compound is very difficult to understand. Average is much easier to understand, but we could not use the term average because we always talk about the Swiss average rate overnight, and 2 averages in one wording would be too much. So we called it SARON compound rates. The pound sterling group hold a consultation on the construction of a SONIA average, but after that consultation, the feedback was a bit ambiguous. They placed it on hold. Nevertheless, we do not recommend the market to put derivatives or loans or bonds directly on the SARON compound rates because they are not flexible enough to cope with any kind of constellation in the business day calendar. So we still recommend to use the official formula recommended by the National Working Group to calculate compounded SARON. And we are happy that SIX has agreed to implement a calculator on their website, which incorporates the official formula recommended by the National Working Group with all its details on specific day count conventions and holiday calendars. And this calculator will be published roughly around August. And this will be an easy access both to market professionals and to retail clients to exactly recalculate the compounded SARON, which they see by dealing with their bank. On the next slide, I focus on something which is in the core of the discussion for the moment in the US and in the pound sterling. It's what we call tough legacy. So something where contracts where you can't get rid of LIBOR. And very important to understand, tough legacy really means tough legacy. So it's not a loophole of converting something which could be somehow transitioned away from LIBOR into a legacy contract, which depends somehow on LIBOR. No, it's only for a very small amount of contracts. For example, in the bond market for floating rate notes tied to LIBOR, it might be very difficult if you have a large number of investors to agree with all these investors on a transition if you do not have a robust fallback language. So floating rate notes which have been issued, say in 2010, 2012, 2014, these might be tough legacy. In Swiss franc, we do not have this kind of floating rate notes outstanding, of LIBOR floating rate notes outstanding significantly after 2021. An example of tough legacy in Swiss franc, it's not tough legacy in Switzerland, but tough legacy in Swiss franc would be some mortgages in other countries, for example, denominated in euro, but where the coupon payment has to be made in Swiss francs. These are rather complex structured products, and there some banks out of Switzerland might have difficulty to transfer them properly to away from LIBOR. Now, what's the remedy? What's the solution for the problem in the UK and in the US, the US dollar and in the pound sterling? Well, actually, there are two approaches. In the US dollar, the US dollar working group, the ARC, has proposed a change of legislation under New York state law, which would allow a significant bunch of the US dollar floating rate note market tied to LIBOR to be dealt with or to have a mandatory transition away from LIBOR. In the pound sterling, they have opted for a very different route, and this, I think, is a very, very interesting one. And they came out with this, I guess, 4 weeks ago. So UK government has decided to update the UK benchmark regulation, which for the time being is exactly the same as the European benchmark regulation. And the UK benchmark regulation will be amended or changed in such a way that after the cessation of pound sterling LIBOR or US dollar LIBOR, whatever, a so-called synthetic LIBOR is set up. And the synthetic LIBOR encapsulates the new compounded SONIA or SOFR plus what we call fallback spread. So this will not be really a LIBOR, but something which is just purely called LIBOR, but which is essentially a encapsulation of the new world. And this would allow only tough legacy contracts to run further until their maturity without relying on a clear LIBOR submission. And we expect that this route will be used by the European benchmark regulation as well. So we're waiting for possibly an amendment by end of this year in the EU BMR as well. On the next slide, almost coming to the end, we come to a slide which is the most important slide for me in this short talk. It's what we call the LIBOR endgame. So how exactly now will LIBOR end? Will it end by cessation? Will it end by non-representativeness? What will happen in the contracts? What will happen in the fallbacks? Is there any kind of voluntary transition and so on? So to study this, we first have to differentiate two different possible ends of LIBOR. One is if the administrator of LIBOR, the ICE benchmark administration, or in short IBA, announces a so-called voluntary discontinuation of LIBOR by probably end of 2021. Such announcement could be made for one currency, for a single currency, for only a couple of tenors, or for any combination of currencies and tenors. And again, for Swiss francs and indeed for the other currencies as well, we expect such an announcement for all tenors in all these currencies. Such a voluntary announcement of voluntary discontinuation by IBA rulebook has to be made at least 1 year in advance. The other route would be that FCA announces a loss of representativeness. That is not that LIBOR ceases to exist, because this decision can only be made by the administrator. But as soon as LIBOR is declared as being not representative anymore by the Financial Conduct Authority, LIBOR won't comply under both EU and UK benchmark regulation, and it won't comply, for example, with regulators' qualitative requirement of proper risk management. So we expect for the moment that LIBOR will die by an announcement of loss of representativeness. And that's exactly why ISTA documentation is delayed. Because when we attended an OSSG meeting, a meeting of the Official Sector Steering Group in January this year in London, the private sector chairs from the US dollar group, pound sterling group, and Swiss franc group asked definitely ISTA to include such a non-representativeness trigger in their fallback language. In earlier recommendations we made in the National Working Group for fallback language in LIBOR contracts, we recommended such a loss of representativeness trigger, or pre-cessation, how we call it. And it was important for us that ISTA follows, because otherwise we would have different triggers in the derivative market, in the cash markets, and this obviously would expose a significant market basis and legal risk. But now we are fine. ISTA will publish documentation with this loss of representativeness trigger, and by end of June, the representative at schooling letter from the Financial Conduct Authority announced publicly that such an announcement of non-representativeness by end of 2021 might come as early as November or December this year. So that's what we expect. We expect that FCA announces by end of this year that Swiss franc LIBOR won't be representative anymore by end of 2021. Personally, I expect this for pound sterling as well, for US dollar as well. And what happens in that specific point at the announcement date? At the announcement date, the so-called fallback spread is fixed, and this fallback spread is then applied as of end of 2021. So what exactly is the fallback spread? That's on the next slide. The fallback spread is what we've seen before, that on the example of 3 months LIBOR, that 3 months SARON compounded is not exactly the same as 3 months LIBOR, although it's very, very close in Swiss franc. So we have to replace 3 months LIBOR by 3 months compounded SARON by plus any kind of spread. And this spread, after extensive market consultation of ISTA, will be calculated as a 5-year historical mean. So in the moment of an announcement of a cessation or loss of representativeness, the calculation goes back for 5 years, and the spread for 1 month's term, 3 months term, 6 months term, 12 months terms between the LIBOR and the corresponding compounded rate in US dollar, pound sterling, and Swiss franc will be calculated. Essentially, these numbers are currently already disclosed or published by Bloomberg. And we know for Swiss francs, they are rather small. So 3 months LIBOR will be replaced by 3 months SARON compounded plus 1 basis point. And 6 months LIBOR will be replaced by 6 months compounded SARON plus either 8 or 9 basis points. There's only a little room to change because we expect this decision to be made by end of this year. And since we talk about the 5-year median, almost everything here is already fixed. And we do expect that this spread calculation, which is officially only valid for the derivative markets, will be the standard in the cash markets as well. So now we just have to wait. We focus for the moment on the development of the corporate markets. We are observing the market rather closely, and you do not have to expect that the National Working Group will come out with breaking news over the next couple of weeks or months, because we feel that we have now specified everything that the market needs to transition away from LIBOR. On the final slide, I've just summarized some sources where you can get some information. You can get some information on an entry level, on a medium level, on an expert level, by approaching NWG Secretariat SMB or myself. You can get some more detailed information, and we're happy for any kind of feedback, for any sharing of know-how. for any remarks and for any question for information. Because what we now have ahead is all about communication. And again, we still strive to complete the LIBOR transition, not by end of 2021, but much earlier for the big chunk of the market.